thank you. Thank you for coming to my session, for spending the next 75 minutes with me. And I want to go and kind of give an introductory talk about Azure Functions. But in particular, I want to really focus on the use cases within Office 365. So it's Azure Functions, practical Azure Functions with Office 365 combined in this session. That button. So a bit about John. My name is John. I'm a senior consultant for SharePoint Guru Sydney. We are a SharePoint. We have been a SharePoint customization consultancy, but in the past few years, we have been doing a lot of work on Office 365. And my background is a .NET developer, so when I first touched SharePoint, it's like, okay, how do I make it not look like SharePoint? How do I customize everything? The customer says they want this. I say, okay, how high do you want it? And then I just change it. In the Office 365 world, with, say, SharePoint Online, the choices for how we can customize SharePoint Online is that there are less choices. And so increasingly, there were thoughts that maybe when we customize Office 365, we shouldn't customize the out-of-the-box experience. If you want to really have a very customized experience, you have to build a separate website and just use SharePoint as one of the many resources. So there's definitely that thought that SharePoint is a service, but not so much as a platform. My talk, I want to talk about SharePoint as a platform and Office 365 as a platform. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP and now an Office 365 MVP. I present many at the various user groups. There is a SharePoint Saturday event or Office 365 Saturday events. How many of you know about these community events? Okay, so these events are put on, the Saturday events, they will happen once in every city around Australia. And they're a Saturday event, but they're a good event to go to learn more about various things. And all the different speakers come to your city. So do find out when that day is for your different cities. And all the major cities in Australia have user groups or meetups, either SharePoint or Office 365. And I encourage you to go there, listen and engage and network and figure out what other people are doing. I learn almost everything from all these user groups. So that's great. Oops, wrong button, that button. I blog on johnliu.net. That's where I blog mostly about development, customization, development, and so on. And you can find me on Twitter, John N. Liu. There's an extra N. Okay, I will start with this story. And this, I don't know what people, you might not know what this is. This is a box of punch cards. Okay, there's an old day with computer. How many of you have actually used punch cards? Great. Then Azure Function, I'm so glad you guys are in this talk. I really am. And I want to give a quick story. My parents met as computer science engineers back in Taiwan in about 1970s. So my mother's first job was in the statistics bureau, and they have this old punch card machine. I have never seen one living or even in a museum. I have never seen these things. But my mother have used them. So one day I was actually preparing for the Ignite, and she came over to visit me. So I suddenly had this thought: what was it like? What were the punch cards like? And she said, I said, are they small? Are they like this? They said, no. She said, it's quite big. It's long. They were longer than I thought. And I said, do you submit a program that's that long? She said, no. Sometimes your program's quite short. It's quite interesting how she describes her program in terms of physical space. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. And then I asked the most puzzling question I have, right? So you can't run this code in your desktop. You have to submit it to an operator to run it for you. What happens when you have errors? Like I will ask this question in a minute. How many of you are developers? I'm a developer. I write code. They don't usually run the first time. Usually, I would like to think they would, but they don't usually run the first. So in the punch card space, how does that work? Like, Mom, you're submitting this code and they get executed in an hour. What do? Do you just go and have a coffee and then? And she would say, oh yeah, you check so much, you double check your work, triple check, make sure there are no errors. And then she realized that it's actually funnier if she tells the truth. She says, actually, they were crushed. And these are the days where there are no monitors. You know, you don't get an error compiler dialog screen. Your output is printouts, right? You guys that have actually used this have to tell me. I'm relying on a secondary information, but I thought it was very interesting. So she would get pages and pages of printouts. Imagine one instruction card is wrong. The rest of it is just errors. So she would get a stack of paper handed back to her. This is the output of your program. So imagine as a developer, this is how you engage with your ops people, right? Say, please run this code. And they give you back a stack of paper and say, your code's not very good. I thought there's so much parallel. I would like to think when you see Azure Functions, you can kind of see there's actually some parallel. You prepare your code and then you submit it to something to run it for you. I'll tell her my story. I'll run my code. And I will also get rows and rows of errors. So it's kind of the same, right? Except it's a computer telling me that I'm a bad programmer, not a real person. So that's probably saved my face a bit. Actually, I haven't got to the demos. And that's the second picture. I would like to wrap that story up. That's the storage for the punch cards. So I found this picture on Wikipedia. That whole warehouse stores program and the data for the program, and that's about 4 gigabytes of data in the whole warehouse. I don't know what the upkeeping cost of that warehouse is. I assume it has to be temperature controlled, otherwise all the paper will rot. So we'd like to know what the monthly cost of that is, right? Compared to something like Azure Functions that we will see. That's a great picture. So the agenda for this afternoon, firstly, I want to give you a quick look. So previously, I have dived right into a bunch of serverless architecture, and what does that mean? And people are saying, wait, I have never seen functions. Can you show me that first? So we'll look at that first. Then we'll talk about what is serverless, what is functions as a service, and what does it mean when we use Azure Functions. And finally, because it's after lunch, most of this session is just various demos. And if you spot an error or if you have a great idea, hey, that code could be changed like this and work better, please let me know. If you're sitting in the back, I don't know how interactive we can be. So if you feel like in the middle of the session you want to move forward, that's completely okay. Okay, very quick look. Let me switch over to the demo. And I'm actually on the pricing page. Let me switch back here first. So to go to Azure Functions, you type functions.azure.com. And this is the landing page, which looks like this. And you have to sign into your account. This could be your personal, this should be your Azure account. They try to make it easier by saying there is a Azure Functions/try. So if you don't have an Azure account, if you don't have any functions, this will be easier. So Azure Functions/try, and you get dropped right into the wizard to create your first function. If I were to go through and create this, it will actually create an additional function app. And I've already got several, so I won't actually hit this button. Okay, so very easy. Basically, currently you can pick between C# and JavaScript. These are the two languages that have already become generally available. And there are various triggers. We'll see a bit more about all these in a minute. Let me just jump into functions a different way. So if I log in generally with the other wizard, eventually you end up on the screen as well. Pick the subscription that you use, and all my demos for today are in this function. So you can also create additional function apps, but all my functions are here, and the funky demo. That is actually the URL of my functions. And the Azure Functions interface sits inside the Azure portal. You can see I've got some credits remaining. Let me hide that. Actually, before I go further, let me see a show of hands. How many of you are developers? Oh, this is great. This is good. And how many of you are IT pros? Or okay, this is good. This is good. How about any power users? So you wouldn't call yourself developers or IT pro? Okay. Well, this is actually somewhat suitable for power users too, but this is good. And if I see a show of hands, how many of you know PowerShell? And with these hands, how many of you were in the Azure automation session earlier? Okay, a whole bunch less of you. Okay, so I might mention a little bit at the end what's the difference between functions and Azure automation. That I think will be quite interesting. But I'll talk about that at the end. Let's have a look at a new function. So you log into the functions interface, you create a new function. I could use the wizard earlier, but here's are the various templates. And I will actually use a C# one. Well, I'm picking the HTTP trigger function. This is a throwaway function. I'm just going to click this. Actually, let me ask another question. So put your hands up if you're comfortable with C# and JavaScript, Node.js JavaScript. Okay, less. And PowerShell? Oh, that's more. Most of my demos are in PowerShell, so this is actually great. Okay, I want to quickly show you. So when you create a function, this is a C# function, and based on which template you choose, it's pre-populated with a bit of code. And basically, this is a HTTP triggered function. So there is a public URL. I'll copy that. That will actually trigger this function. Now, functions have a few things to it. Functions have a thing called a function key. If I show it, you'll see the key is actually the same as this code that's here. So basically, if Google were to crawl my URL without the code, my function is not triggered. So it's kind of a secret key that you will keep. And you can create new ones, you can revoke this key, and so on. Okay? Because of the pricing model of functions, if your function code doesn't run, so say the Google crawler finds your Azure website but doesn't call with the key, then your function doesn't run and then you don't pay for it. Okay? So slightly different from, say, Azure website where you're hosting a website 24/7 and these services may or may not be called. In the case of a function, if your server's code doesn't run, then you don't pay. Okay? And these are the keys. Cancel that. The test panel is where we can do basically inline testing. So here I could, and if I hit logs, you can see the logs. It's kind of duplicated in two places. I could pretty much run the code right away. It's going to execute. And can you read this? Can you read this? Yeah. So it says C# function trigger has processed, and it's actually finished. So the whole thing runs in about 0.1 seconds, and it says hello Azure. And if I say what to have, and because you could call this via a URL, let me go to another web page. Name. So one of the parameters that it accepts is name. Let's say hello ignite. So you see, it's called my function, and then I've got hello ignite. Oh, can you see it? A bit bigger? Sorry. Well, maybe not that big. Hello ignite. Okay, if I switch back here, you'll see it's run one more time. Okay, so that's my test run, and then it's run again. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's what Azure Function is. And you can configure, and then let me, the field tabs kind of show you the various files in this current function. There is the function, the run file, which is where your JavaScript, where your C# script is. And then there is the function JSON. So every function has this function.json, which describes the binding. And basically, you're describing what are the input triggers and what is the output. Okay, so the return out, and then the function. Was there another thing I want to show? I did want to show you this. A few more things, which I think I'll kind of mention up front, then we kind of use it quite a bit later, so I don't need to talk about it. With functions, there's really this thought that, and this is probably a thought with serverless architectures in general, in that you should write code that, any code that you write, you have to maintain. So you should try to write as little code as you can, right? And functions really help you with this. Say, for example, on the trigger, when someone calls my function, I actually want to pull some sort of XML or configuration data from a blob storage I already have, right? So in your mind, you're thinking, okay, that means in my code, I'll connect to my storage and then pull this stream out and then use it as part of my calculations and then do whatever. But what functions gives you is this easy way of adding additional inputs. So if I have a file in a blob storage or in Azure table, you could just pretty much click the wizard and say, yep, and that's one of my existing blob storages, and the name of the container is that one. And when Azure function triggers from the HTML, you get the blob storage input as well directly as an additional argument. And that will happen essentially here. So I won't say OK, but in here you will get an additional stream. So the function gets executed with both the trigger and all the input. Like the request here is part of the HTTP trigger that includes all the HTTP headers and the body. But you can also add additional input. And at the same time, you can also add additional output. So if your function, say, was to trigger from an Azure queue, right? You say, anytime someone puts a message into the Azure queue, I want to run my function. So function can be hooked up like that. And then you can just configure the output to Azure blob storage. And then in your actual function code, it's literally input, copy to output. And that's all your code. Right? So the least code you have to write inside your function, the less you pay. So this is, everyone wins. What else? One little more that I think is really cool. The thing that's really cool is this one. So functions sits on top of Azure App Services. So as you dive into the settings, you can get into all the app services settings. There's a whole bunch of them. But the fun one is this one that they kind of bring forward. This one is called configure CORS. Configure CORS lets you specify various URLs. So if you're doing any sort of JavaScript, you probably know this. Your JavaScript is trying to, say you're doing some code in a browser, and you want to call an additional service to do some sort of work for you. Generally, your browser will not post to an external domain. Right? It says, hey, there's a cross-origin domain. You can't make that call. I'm actually going to stop right now. Now, the browsers can allow this particular type of action if the other domain immediately says, actually, I accept this. Okay, so that's the cross-origin resource sharing. If you say, I'm building a website, and you just want to call, like submit some sort of data to an Azure function, then you need to set up the CORS. And you basically say, this function can be called via JavaScript from these known URLs. And if you're doing a customization, say in SharePoint Online, you should put the SharePoint Online URL in here as well. I've heard another story with some people have very basic static websites. So imagine you have I don't know what more than, say, just a really static website. And you don't really have any capability to run server-side code. But then you can then put some sort of logic behind an Azure function and then have a very simple JavaScript form that posts the data to your function. You see how that flow works? Okay, so that's quite a common scenario. Okay. I think that's let me switch back to the slides. Okay, cool. So that's what the Azure function looks like. So I want to dial back a bit and talk about what is serverless. So when people say serverless, what is it? And really, I call it, honestly, I call it a buzzword. But you kind of need a word to describe this type of new architecture. Why are people talking about serverless programming. Why is this a big deal suddenly? And serverless it describes an emerging architecture. We probably started hearing about this word from about 2015. And Azure Function really came into preview about mid last year, about mid 2016 it came in. And it's really an emerging architecture of writing services or microservices on top of function as a service, okay? And some people say, oh, okay, if you write, you probably have, how many of you have heard the word service-oriented architecture? Okay, that was a buzzword about maybe 5, 10 years ago. So that type of thinking. Generally, serverless, function as a service, or even if you go back to the service-oriented architecture, this describes decoupling your application into lots of different services. But for developers or for us that are building solutions, it's hard to do this because this is not how we think, right? When people say, hey, we want you to do a work, it's a website with a bunch of web services. So it's hard to decouple that thinking and say, why do we suddenly need to break the whole app into multiple services? Like, what's the benefit here? And really, the reason that serverless, I think it really took off this time is purely because one of the major drivers is the cost. All right, one more point. It doesn't mean no server. There is server. Servers are running in Azure, but it's less of our own responsibility. Azure manages all the states of the servers. And so the essence of serverless, I want to boil it down to 4 points. First is reduce the code that you write, particularly if you're accessing additional resources. I kind of showed that. You can configure additional input and output, so you don't have to write that code. You want to pay only what you use. So Azure Functions is calculated very interestingly. It's calculated gigabyte memory per second. So they give you a free bucket every month. It's 400,000 gigabyte, 400,000 gigabyte per second of memory. And that means if you think about how long your function will run, right? If your function runs, say, that little trigger function runs within 0.1 second, it probably takes 100 meg, I don't know how much memory it takes. But let's say it generously took 100 megabyte of memory, we could run 4 million of those requests and not pay a cent. Okay, so that's where I think that's one of the key reasons why serverless suddenly became a very hot buzzword. For us that are customizing, say, Office and SharePoint, we often needed, we could do a lot of the customization on the front end, right, with some jQuery, with some Angular or React. But there was always times where we have to then put some code on a server, right? You have to suddenly find a server to run that timer job. You have to hook up to a remote event receiver, or you have to, another common pattern is a permission elevation. So any JavaScript code that you run inside the web browser runs as a current user. But there are times where you want to elevate and run as a higher level account. So Azure Function is perfect for that. Azure Functions auto-scale on demand. So generally, it keeps that instance for you. So if I hit the function repeatedly, it's the same instance that's running it. But they do monitor, and when it's too busy, they will copy and auto-scale. So you essentially have multiple copies of the function handling all the different requests. And finally, it responds to events and triggers. And that is an actual slide I want to show you. That is, in practice, the cost. So that is actually my Azure subscription for pay-as-you-go. You will see the app service plan and the app service, they are all at 0 because I never hit that free bucket. So the 400,000 gigabit second quota per month, I never hit that limit, so I never get charged for compute. All the costs that I'm charged are to do with storage. So that the files that you store, they incur a cost. Now, generally, the files are not just that one script. Generally, you add additional libraries, right? Like when you write a .NET code, you want to add NuGet and add several supporting libraries. If you're using JavaScript, you're pulling in Node modules. So those actually have a space cost to it. I'll show you that when we look at Node in a minute. So yeah, that's my cost per month. 2 Azure functions cost me 38 cents a month. So from both from the MVP program and from my company, I get $200 credits. And now I've turned out all my VMs and I spend 37 cents every month. I thought it's kind of ridiculous. I just thought I'll write everything as functions from now on. So actually, I do have a question. How many of you have Azure VMs running right now? You know you have? Okay. And how many of you think it's not really doing anything right now, like no one's actually talking to it? Okay, and it's eating your credits, right? So, Azure Function could be a good solution that you should look into purely on the cost benefit. And we'll look at, do I have more slides? Yeah, that's my question. Now, there is a session on serverless architecture at 5 o'clock, and the presenter will cover more C#. So I will skip C#, because I kind of showed C# a little bit in the brief intro. Let me go to the next one, which is Node.js. Sorry, can I switch to demo again? Okay. For now, it's all demo. We'll just demo all the way to the final slide. So here's a Node.js. Let me start with a new blank one so you see what it looks like. If I pick JavaScript, and then I pick HTTP trigger. So in JavaScript, and in particular, this is server-side JavaScript, so running with Node.js, the actual JavaScript file needs to return a function. So this JavaScript function is the thing that Azure Function calls, okay? And you are given a context object that represents the state of this running instance and the request that represents the trigger. And this one is pretty similar to the Hello Azure one. So if the query has a name property, or if the body has a name property, then say hello. Otherwise, return a status error and finish. Okay, so if I run that, it's pretty much the same. It's going to say, what's it going to say? Please enter the name, I think. Oh, there you go. So it just says, hello Azure. Oh yeah, because it runs with this. Right. So you can use this interface to quickly test your function. If you are testing the different JSON parameters that you're passing to your function, you can use this quite quickly. Now let me go back here. We're kind of going to dive a little bit deeper. So this is the only JavaScript demo. The rest are PowerShell. So if you think, oh, I'm more of a ID pro with PowerShell, JavaScript is not my thing, then you only have to live through this one. But this is the fun one. You should learn more languages. Okay. With JavaScript, typically what you need to do first is just the raw JavaScript is not enough. You need some additional libraries to help you, right? So in my particular script, I need 2 libraries. One is a fetch library. This is for me to make asynchronous requests. If you're familiar with jQuery, jQuery can be used on the server side as well, so you could just use jQuery. And we need another library called add-node. Add-node is the Active Directory Authentication Library, so it's ADO. And generally, there are 2 flavors for JavaScript. There's add.js, and then there's add.node. Because we're running on Node.js, we need the add.node library. We also need a file system, but that one is a default one that's provided by Node.js. So just that will be enough. To install these 2 libraries, you actually need to drop into the backend. I'll show you what it looks like. It basically appears here under Node modules. How many of you are familiar with NPM or Node? Okay, that's a hint. So basically, when you install JavaScript libraries, you run a npm command. It's kind of like NuGet, and it pulls down the libraries. The thing with this is, one library has dependencies on 10 additional libraries, which has dependencies on another 20 libraries. So you're installing 2 libraries, but if I run it now, we'll be here till dinner, you know. But anyway, let me just quickly show you. So to drop into the backend, we go to the function settings, and then there's a button. Let me go back and quickly show. I clicked too quickly. So if I go to the backend, to the function app settings, there is kudu. That helps us drop into the backend. Then we need to navigate to the site, which is that one. And then here, we type npm initialize. And you need the y parameter for taking all the defaults. Because we're trying to create a package.json. It's a description of all the libraries that we use. This is a remote web-based command line, but it's not interactive. So any kind of command that gives you a wizard that says, hey, what do you want to call the project? Hey, is it a web or a browser project? Like that kind of interactive, it won't work. So you need to type it with the y, take the defaults, and then we can do install add our node, and I think I use node fetch. So if I run that, it will finish probably in about 10 minutes. Okay, this is a project that I've already run it on, so I won't do it. But basically, that will put the file in here. So if I come back to here, come back at function, oops. Come back, you see the various libraries that it pulls down. So it will create the node modules folder, and then pull down the libraries that they use. This is really why I'm paying 20 cents. Because if you think about it, one file of JavaScript, that's gonna cost me maybe 1 cent a month. But when you're adding .NET or JavaScript libraries, you tend to pull down quite a lot more stuff, and they're all sitting in your storage account. So I end up paying 20 cents because of JavaScript, really. Now let's have a look at this code real quick. This is the fun part. Back to this index.json. So when you're writing code within functions to talk to Office 365, it's always 2 steps. It's like a boxing, there's 2 steps. The first step is you need to authenticate. Authenticate with Azure directory and get a token. Once you have a token, you can talk to any of the web services within Office 365. You can go from SharePoint, which is my early examples, all the way to the graph, all the way to Power BI, all the way to OneNote. All these endpoints are open to you, but you need a token to talk to them. Okay, so here's the little bit of code. I'm not actually going to type anything. I'm just going to show you. So there are a bunch of variables here. I want to talk to a particular SharePoint resource. I need to log in through Microsoft AD first. SharePoint Online is very peculiar. In most of these resources, like Planner, Exchange, these resources don't need a client certificate. As long as you have a client ID and client secret, it's good enough. With SharePoint Online, you do need a client certificate for this type of authentication. So here I'm using the add-our library, which gives me an object called the authentication context. Pass that the URL. Then I'm calling the method acquire token with client certificate, which is the ID, the certificate, which is this file. It's actually my private key. And then a thumbprint of the certificate. So that's purely if you want to do app-only permission with SharePoint Online. That's the only situation you need this client certificate. So I did this work, and what was interesting is a colleague of mine wanted to do some work with Xero. How many of you use Xero, the accounting kind of? So we have this thing where our timesheets are in SharePoint Online, but we want to synchronize it to Xero, which doesn't really give us a nice interface. But Xero has all these node projects and URLs that we can talk to, and we were reading the documentation. To talk to 0, you need a client certificate. So you can generate your own certificate, publish the public key with them, and then hold your private key in your Azure function. And in a day, my colleague was talking to 0. So it's interesting. I always thought the client ID, client certificate is a peculiar case. People don't use it, but it turns out it's quite useful, that type of scenario. Anyway, authenticate. If we error, we'll just say, well, it doesn't work. But if we're successful, we'll get access token. And I've commented out the rest of the code, so we can just run that. So that's actually going to go and talk to my Office 365. Talk to my SharePoint in particular. I think the function's gone to sleep. When that happens, it takes a couple of seconds, maybe 20 seconds to warm up. The way functions work and the way that function is so cheap, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it's this. Imagine Microsoft have data centers with lots of VMs, right? A lot of VMs are not actually doing anything. They're just sitting around. Maybe they're waiting for new workload. Maybe, anyway, they're just sitting around. So with the way the functions work is Microsoft finds a VM that's already warmed up, so they're not starting a new machine from scratch. They find an existing VM that's already running, copy your code in there, and then run it. And then when it's finished, they delete the whole thing. Okay, so that's why it's so cheap. Essentially, you're just borrowing some spare bandwidth that's left over. And imagine any data center in Microsoft Azure data centers, there's plenty of bandwidth compute sitting everywhere waiting to be used. So they are very happy for you to use as much functions as you can. And they give you a very generous free bucket. While I'm talking, so it took about a second to warm up. If I run it again, you'll see the second time is quicker. But essentially, that is the key to my, see, I better not scroll all the way to the end, because this is kind of being recorded. I kind of trust you guys can't remember this key, but some crazy guy may. Maybe they look at it frame by frame and copy it down. But anyway, with that key, you can then talk to SharePoint. Okay. Let me, how do I compress that? And let me just uncomment the rest of this code. So the rest of this code, I'm saying, if the query body has a name property, let me go back to here, has a name property. This editor is a web editor, but you type your familiar keystrokes like Control-K, Control-C, it uncommented, and it's almost like Visual Studio. And then this is the query I'm actually calling. So I'm calling SharePoint Online's own API. If you're doing any sort of customizations within SharePoint, these URLs will be familiar to you. I'm calling the search API with the query string passed in. So I'm basically asking SharePoint, can you make a search on this particular keyword? And then let me just uncomment. So that's the fetch library, which I will use to make the actual query, the asynchronous query. That returns a promise that says it's kind of ready, and then I read the whole body out as JSON. So by this time, we will have the result, the search result from SharePoint as a JSON object. Now, I was talking to some people in the audience. SharePoint has a lot of historic baggage, and this is one of them. When the search interface was written, it's clearly written to be sent to a table, because the JSON that comes back has this crazy thing. It's pretty crazy. I'm looking at this going, anyway. So let me just run that. Imagine mistyping this in the punch card days. It'd be ridiculous. Okay, so that's the actual JSON. That's the actual query. So with the token that I've got, I built this query to send to SharePoint, and then I've got this result back. How to see this? But essentially, these are the JSON of the search results from my SharePoint tenant being split back. And you can write that to the function. Yeah, you can write that to the function. Why is that not written? Hold on. done has already been called. Oops. Sorry. Yeah. So with the JavaScript code, you are passed a context, and you have to call the done method on the context when you're finished. Because within your JavaScript code, you might be doing some asynchronous things, right? So it's not just run to the end of this function and then please kill everything. It's, well, inside this function, I'm doing some callbacks, things might be happening. So until you call context.done, the environment doesn't collapse, okay? So that's that. And on my done here, I'm returning the results. So you see my function actually spits out JSON back to whoever is calling me. If I take this URL and go to maybe here, and let's look for John. Oh, no, that's not how you write this. Name is John, right? Yeah, so you get the JSON right back, okay? So this should give you lots of ideas about what you could build. I don't know. You guys are sitting so far, it's hard to see. It's hard to see your expression. If you're excited, put up your hand. Oh, this is quite good. You should totally sit in the front. That will totally help. Okay, now let's go on. We have more demo to do. So the second demo I want to show you is the thing, is actually site provisioning. If you are, before I get to this point, let me show you a few websites. This website is called Office PMP. So SharePoint and Office 365 developer pattern and practices. How many of you have seen this website or are using this stuff from here? Okay, only a few of you. But a lot of you know of this website. So basically, both Microsoft and a lot of Microsoft's partners have contributed to this open source repository with various different libraries and code examples about how to do the best practices. Initially just SharePoint, but now also extending to most of Office 365. Okay? So the pattern and practice is a C# library, is several C# libraries. The main one is this provisioning library. And let me come back to this code. One more, sorry. And so Fessa is the person mostly, he's the gatekeeper in charge of the PMP project. But there's another guy, Erwin. He contributed by adding PowerShell commandlets around all these C# libraries. So imagine you have C# libraries designed for a developer to say, go and get a list of items, or go and copy all these documents, or go check in, check out, or publish these sites. These were all built initially as C# libraries, but then a PowerShell wrapper was put around them. So if you go to the PMP PowerShell repository, you'll see all the different commandlets. There's pages and pages of commandlets, and there's documentation for most of them too. Yeah, all these commandlets. So I wanted to show you something real quick. How many of you were in Elaine's session earlier in the morning about modern sites? And she talked a little bit about provisioning a site with some code, yeah, with the PowerShell. So she mentioned this as well with the PMP PowerShell. I want to kind of just show you what that looks like in Azure Function. So with Azure Functions, when you're picking a language, you can actually pick. Let me show you this because this is interesting. See, when you pick PowerShell, it says experimental because the PowerShell support in Azure Functions has not been it's not GA, it's still in preview. So the template is called experimental. I make a joke that actually the world is not ready for PowerShell. We're not ready. It's not the server's not ready, I'm not ready. And I think you'll see why. So to talk to PowerShell, especially using Azure, using the PMP commandlets, it makes a whole lot of things a lot easier. So in my case, I need to create a credential, so a username and password. I created a separate account, just a service account. So I don't want to use a user account that expires when I leave. So I just create a separate account. It has a password. It's for my SharePoint site. And then within PowerShell, this is how you create a credential object. So PS credential object. And then basically, I'm using the PowerShell commandlet to connect to SharePoint. So you can essentially say connect PMP online with your SharePoint and then the URL, and that will connect you right to SharePoint. Okay, one line. With your credential, then one line. And then we can call get PMP web. So that will give you the current SharePoint site, see if that's it. If you get an error, then that means it's not there. We go to the root web and we just create one. So again, that's another PMP commandlet that just says, create a brand new site. It's going to use the team site template. PMP is very clever in that if you have saved site as template, so if you have saved templates, you can use those. You can use any of the out-of-the-box templates. So there's quite a lot of variation in how you can specify the template. And then beyond that, I'm doing pretty much what Elaine was doing as well, in that you can use PMP pointed to a site and then generate an XML from it that describes all the document library you want to be provisioned, all the security level, all the navigation settings, even the language settings for the site. You can spit that out to an XML file, and then you can just call apply PMP template, specify the web and the file name to your file. And that will basically stem the site onto the new site that you just created. Okay? And that's it. That's it. That's PowerShell. What you can also do is this, I commented this part of the code out. You can, within your PowerShell, connect to your template site, take a live copy of the template, and then go to your new site and then stamp it. So you essentially, your template is now just a site that's living there. And you could just, anytime someone makes a change, you could stamp it onto all the new sites. Another benefit of PMP provisioning template is it can stamp onto existing sites. So a lot of the previous provisioning for SharePoint sites, you can only use it for new sites. You can't do it onto an existing site. The PMP provisioning engine can. So it will detect if you don't have this document library, it will create it. If you don't have this navigation or web part, it will create that too. So you can configure document libraries. It could set up your home page with all the web parts pre-configured. So if you are, say, using this system to deploy new sites for each new team that you're spinning up, you can pre-configure which web part goes where, and so on. So very cool. And they already support all the modern team sites. So all the new SharePoint Framework web parts, they all work inside this template. So if you're thinking about, okay, people say, well, what do you think? Do you think this is too hard? Do you think this is easy? This looks easy. Actually, let me ask it properly. Does this look easy? Oh, that's great. That's great. I'll show you this picture because this is what I always thought was a big contrast. So this is the provisioning framework in C#. And if you really look at it, this is what it is. You say, with the current context, get the template. That's copying the template, right? And then you could decide to save your template to XML or where do you want? Put it into Azure Blob Storage. And then you load the template and then copy it onto a new site. That's what we just did in PowerShell, but in maybe 2 or 4 lines of PowerShell. You understand? So when I look at this, I thought, this is not too hard if you're a developer looking at this. But most people look at this and say, wow, that's quite complicated. First of all, where am I going to run this code? I need to go and buy an Azure web job just to run this. And if you look at this connector with, okay, if I pull down the template, where am I going to store it? Right? So in my example, you could just store, I copied the XML directly into Azure Function, but you could store it into blob storage as well. And you can use that with the input and output trigger on the function. So when you want to take a template, you push the template out to blob storage. But when you're just creating a new site, you could read from blob storage and then take the XML there. All right. So I thought that was a lot of great work, but the flowchart makes it look complicated. Whereas when you look at it in PowerShell, it's like connect to the site and apply a template. It's 2 lines. I added a few parameters. So when this function is triggered, there are 4 parameters I'm taking through: the URL, the title, the description of the site. And in fact, let me just quickly check it's not there. Yeah, so there's no site ignite. Let me just run this. So that's going to create ignite as a subsite under my, oh, okay. So when it runs, it loaded a whole bunch of DLLs. The PMP PowerShell wraps around the PMP C# library. So when the function runs, it loads all these libraries into memory and then runs them. Potentially, I'm thinking there might be ways to optimize this. Like if you think your commandlets don't really use 4 or 5 of these DLLs, maybe you could get rid of them. Maybe because less is loaded into memory, you're using less, but probably also less is stored inside your function app. So you might save 4 cents every month if you clean it up. But I just went the easy route. So while that's running, so you can see it's connected to my site. It can't see it. So it's trying to make ignite under my site root. While it's doing that, I want to show you something with this kudu. So we're going to go back. So that was Node.js and how you can add libraries. For for PowerShell, what you need to do is you need to come here and create a modules subfolder. And inside the modules, I copied this URL. So this part is not very slick. When you install the SharePoint PMP commandlets, it puts these DLLs. So these are basically the PMP DLLs. It puts these DLLs in your PowerShell path in your local machine. So the way you make sure the PowerShell works is you copy all this and you drag and drop into this, and it will upload them all into functions. Okay? So your PowerShell that we write, the 2 lines, or the 2 lines of PowerShell, it needs the commandlets, which is backed by these C# libraries. So to fulfill that dependency, you need to just drag and drop and put that in. This part is not as slick as, say, an install module. That would be great. Because in PowerShell, usually in Windows, you type install module with the module name. It pulls it from the PowerShell gallery and pre-configures everything. This part doesn't do it. And they tell me it's because it's not released yet, so I could tell them stuff that they'll put onto their wish list, but it's not released yet. I personally think this is kind of that one-time setup pain, but afterwards, this is just too much fun. Oh, okay, while I'm talking, it's finished. So you see, I made a new site, and then I applied the template. Let me just take that URL. If I come here. See, Ignite Us is created less than a minute ago. And it's painted gray. So if I create a brand new site, usually it's just black and blue. But the provisioning template had a color scheme to it. So it's just to show that it's applying a template. Okay. How many of you could use this? Oh, that's great. All right, next one, very quick. This one is quicker. In this example, I want to talk to the Microsoft Graph. Okay, so the resource I want to talk, again, is PowerShell. I want to talk to Microsoft Graph. To talk to Microsoft Graph, you don't really need that client certificate thing, so it's a little bit easier. In fact, with the PMP, we piggyback the work that's done inside C# that did the whole authentication. So it looked like the authentication is very easy, but actually it's because the code is hidden inside that C# library that we borrowed. But if we want to talk to Graph, it could be a lot easier. So to talk to Graph, we can use, if we go to Azure Apps, Azure App, yeah, we go to Azure Active Directory, sorry, and register an app. That's what I want to say. Let me take a sip of water. So we register an app with a client ID and client secret, and then that's the tenant ID of my Active Directory. Then I can talk to the Graph. The way to do it is, again, construct the URL and then construct the actual body that gets posted. The actual request is this one line. It says, perform a web request to my Azure AD. I want a client credential, and I'm after the OAuth 2 token. Okay, so if I run that, I'll get the token back. Once I have the token, I could talk to Graph. So here, I'm talking to Microsoft's Graph API. And let me just show you that URL. How many of you have played with Graph? Okay, once you combine them with functions, you'll be playing with it all the time. It's fantastic. So groups is here. So these are the Office 365 groups, and you can talk to this API. You could do order by name if you want. But basically, to call this API, you need the key, right? You need the token. Once you have the token, all these APIs are open to you, but you need the token. So that request will give you the token. That's one request. And this second request will talk to Graph. And if I run this, and I ran it before, but let me run it again. It's back. So that's that one. So these are the various Office 365 groups that I have within my Azure tenant. And that request takes less than a second, really, to run. So these are pretty crazy. And let me do one more. These requests, so the endpoint doesn't only take GET requests. So you can say call GET on a list, and it gives you a list of all the groups. You can also call POST to essentially create new groups. So if I say here, I want this to be, I already have a PS Ignite. Let me call it MSAU Ignite. So if I run that parameter is going to be passed through to the display name, but also the mailbox. And that's going to run. And you see it's already finished. So it's called the Graph endpoint with the token key, and it's created the MSAU Ignite. That's the mailbox and the group. So if I head over to my Office 365, and if I go to groups, all my groups have a Lord of the Ring theme. Discover. So here we go, MSAU Ignite. So that's pretty much generated 3:42. What time zone is that? Oh, that's Sydney time. Yeah. So that's pretty much PowerShell to generate a group. So that example is a different authentication. It's much simpler. We are not taking, say, a dependency on PnP library. So the actual code for this particular PowerShell is super simple. There is no extra libraries. We're making two requests, one to Azure AD to get our token. So basically knock on the door and get our key. And then we talk to Graph. And that's really just 2 lines. And you will see also, because it's so few lines of code, it runs so much quicker. I think it's also because it's not trying to load a C# library first before it does any work. So this one is extremely fun. And once you have the data back, you could spit it back to whoever is calling, right? So imagine if you have a webpack and you want to know what's the, give me a JSON of everyone's calendar. You can have this pulled for everyone, and just make it available internally inside intranet dashboard. So that's that particular example. One final one. This one, I'm back to PMP again. So this one is actually an example that a couple of users, so I wrote up a blog post about late last year about using PMP particularly. And quite a few people contacted me since, and then we have worked on. So if if after today you go and write a really amazing script, really, please let me know and we'll share it with the world. I think there's a great story to tell if you're using PMP to essentially write these micro functions that you can then plug into all these endpoints. This particular one is actually using PMP to checking files within SharePoint. So with PMP, there is a command called PMP get list item. You can pass in a camel. So I get to show camel query on stage. But basically, I'm checking if the checkout user is not null. And if I get a list of items, then I loop through them, and I use another PMP command called PMP file checking to check that file in. Okay? So let me show you that. And let me refresh this. Check out that. That's my branch manager. And look at all the things. So I check in 2 files. Actually, let me do 3. Let me do another one. And I won't check in yet. I'll just show you this. So again, it's loading all those libraries before it does anything. It's connecting to my site. It's going to run, and it's found 3 files. See here? It's found 3 files. And one of the things I find very useful, this is probably a tip only for SharePoint lists, but PowerShell has these utilities that are just super useful. The field values is a dictionary of keyed and values. If I comment this out, you see, so I'm basically printing out what that value is. You'll see it just says this, or it's a dictionary of string and objects. So that's not very useful for debugging. But if I then pipe that object to, there's a PowerShell commandlet convert to JSON. It converts that list item to a JSON string. See this? So I essentially took a list item, the 3 checked out items, and just spat the whole list item into a JSON. Right? And then you can see, oh, okay, that's the property I want. Like I want the file URL. Where is it? File URL, file ref here. So that's the branch manager, the dog picture. Yeah, so that's that. So then I use that particular property, and then I call set file checking on that. So I think that's a really great tip. If you're using PowerShell inside functions, convert to JSON is really good at looking at what that object looks like. And let me just run that again, and that's going to check in on my code. Yeah, it's found 3, and then it's complete. So if I go back to SharePoint, if I refresh, you see the 3 files, the 3 that has the green star next to it, they've been checked in by my service account. Okay? So I hope I give you lots of ideas on how you can do it. So within SharePoint, the PMP commandlets really helps you. PMP commandlets also is expanding to all the Office 365 via the Graph API. But a lot of that you can directly just query, get a key, and then talk to Graph directly. So with the Graph API, as Microsoft add additional endpoints, graph.microsoft.com, actually, .io. So .com is the actual endpoint, .io is the documentation. If I go here, luckily this is not part of my demo, so if it crashes, it's not me. Oh, here we go, I have this here. So, firstly, there are all the existing G8 endpoints. You can talk to users, Exchange, calendar, groups, directory. And then there's the beta endpoint, all the way from Planner, Excel, Intune. Those are new. Okay. Let me switch back to the deck and wrap up. Let me switch back to the PowerPoint. Oh, thank you. So we will look at Node.js, we look at PowerShell, particularly with PMP and REST. What will you build tomorrow? Actually, I have one more demo. Sorry, let me go back to the demo. I just remembered. One more quick demo. This part is not pretty. Well, let me do it in two parts. When Microsoft has this product called Flow, you might have seen and been mentioned this whole. Let me go here. This one I think is dead. I think these both are dead. This is the first time Chrome has crashed before IE does. I think that's kind of a record. Let me do the rest in IE then. Let me sign in. My IE may not sign into that demo tenant, which is why I was using Chrome. Yeah. Oh my God. Let me try Chrome again. Anyway. Technically, I don't need to, because it's an endpoint, I don't need to be using the same tenant from Flow to call that endpoint, so I could run it from here. Let me create one from blank. So within Microsoft Flow, there's really this concept that you can trigger off some event, and quite a common one that people use is a SharePoint event. So within a SharePoint, when a file is created, trigger my event. And then you can connect it to, there are a few ways to do this. You could do HTTP. You see this one that says a HTTP trigger. So with this, you could say, I want to post to that URL that I have, which is, this is weird. Sorry, I do need the URL, so it's hard to show you. But you could paste that function URL and then configure the body. And the way the body works is kind of like this. You will say name is equal to that parameter that I wanted. And one of the things with Flow is, because there's no trigger. Let me delete this. So SharePoint, when a new item is created. I'm always curious how it reads this list, because it reads lists that includes my local domains. I don't know how that works. Anyway, just me contemplating. Let me show you this action. So there are two ways to do this. One is the HTTP request, where you specify the URL. The other way is you can actually specify a Swagger file. A Swagger file is like, there was a time where we built XML web services, and then there is a web service definition file. It kind of describes how your web service look like. So a Swagger file is basically that, but in a JSON format. I want to show you what that looks like very quickly. This one do tend to make a developer's eye bleed, so you guys need to be mentally prepared. A lot of JSON, but basically that's the name of the function app. It's HTTPS always. And in my case, I actually have multiple web services. I have that's the JavaScript one, that's the PowerShell one. These are all PowerShell. And I even include the default code. So what this Swagger file does is, when you give this to a power user within both Flow and Power App, they could go to the data connections, add the Swagger file, and your whole functions becomes one data source within these tools. So within Flow, you can then say that the name of my function is called Funky Demo. So within Flow, you could say Funky Demo, and then it will list the 4 methods that I publish, including the parameters that I use. So here I describe, okay, to do a search, you need this code, which is filled in by default, and then you need a body that has this argument 1. And argument 1 basically has a property called name, and it's a type string, and its example text is Azure. So the Swagger file kind of gives a very simple definition that you could give to your power users and say, hey, here's a list of our functions that we published, and then they could embed that into their workflow. They can use it in Flow, they can use it in Power Apps. So that's, and they have a very nice syntax, and it does type checking. So where your function says, I'm expecting a number or I'm expecting a string, that gets pushed onto, say, Power Apps. So within Power Apps, they could bind that to a button and say, funky demo.create site, and then it's expecting the name of the site. Okay, so that's where Swagger fits in relation to, the power user tools and how that fits. Sorry, let me get back to the demo, to the slides, and now wrap up. Thank you. So what do you want to build today? So a whole bunch of places where you can connect to. You can connect to SharePoint. You can connect to webhooks. Currently, they're G8 for Exchange, but they're also in preview for SharePoint now. You can connect to Flow, which I talked about. You can connect to Logic Apps, and you can connect to Power Apps. With the 3 apps, the Flow, Logic Apps, and Power Apps, I tend to see that you could do a lot of things out of the box. But when you hit that point where you just want to do something custom, and there's no object that does what you want, then that's where Azure Functions fits very well. Because you could essentially say, okay, just give me a block where I'm going to run my code. That's where Azure Functions fits very well. Flow and Logic Apps can talk to functions directly, but you need to be in the same Azure account. Okay, so if your function is published to the same account, then you can see your own functions. You can even call from SharePoint 2013 workflow. So SharePoint 2013 workflow has a particular method called call HTTP request. So if you use that, you can actually use that to construct a JSON, which you can then send to a function. So it's quite interesting in that if you are using SharePoint workflows, and from there you want to kick off some additional complex task. Back in on-premises, we will build a .NET custom workflow activity. But in the online world, the Azure function fits that piece very well. There is also a story to tell in the bot side. So there are a lot of sessions talking about bots. Functions fit very well in that space as well, because your bot could be a 24/7 thing, listening to what the user is asking them to do. And then say if you ask your bot to create a team site or perform a search in SharePoint, your bot could pass that work to a function to do the work. The function returns the data back to the bot. And then so the bot doesn't need to know all this code about how to talk to all these services. So there's definitely a story there. So any sort of reactive thing where you need some sort of event receiver, the functions could be scheduled on a timer. So you could say run that once a day. We often have this requirement that the business wants say, can you on every Sunday look through the list of tasks and everything that's being assigned but not actioned from the last week, can you create an email and send that to someone? So that type of scenario, if you think about it, okay, it's hard to do in a workflow, and you want to run it on Sunday when no one's in a browser, so you can't use just raw JavaScript. Functions work very well for that. Set it up, run it once a week on the weekend, pull through a list, create your email, and send that off. Yeah, a lot of ways. I keep hearing new scenarios. People are thinking how they can use functions. So it's very exciting. For developers, we have the most choices. C#, I think, is still best for speed. When you write PowerShell, it's very asynchronous. Oh, I need to wrap up. The tooling for C# is the best. JavaScript, you can do it with Node.js and VS Code. PowerShell, if you're lazy like me, but also is highly readable. So I do encourage even developers to look at PowerShell and how that could really help you. For IT pros, the PowerShell is really good. I think there's a lot of value to build this set of microservices. You can work with your Power user to build, business scenarios. You could probably teach me lots of things about PowerShell. I'm very newbie at PowerShell. And I think Power users, the step one of the Power users is the Swagger file. Once you have the Swagger file, it lights up Power Apps and Flow and Power Apps light up. Okay, so we covered serverless architecture, lots of demos. I hope you enjoyed the demos. When you later, give me a loud clap when you enjoy the demo. And talk about I will take some questions if you have any. I might take the questions up here later because I need to wrap up. So do continue Ignite Learning. There's various URLs and on Channel 9. There are a lot of sessions I would like to send you guys to. There is a group session. There is another serverless session at 5 p.m. That one will cover a little bit more on C#, so do go to that one. And then there's more about deploying groups. And the Friday one, I really like the part about Power BI and Flow. So I put that one up there as well. For Azure Functions, you need to go to that site, functions.azure.com/try. That's where everything starts. Do complete your eval forms to win the drone. And thank you very much.